is the Tuesday, June 27th work session of the Portland City Council. Carla, please call the roll.
It's a work session. We don't need the roll.
Great. You know, I show up on time. I got my binder. I've got my water and my coffee, and we're ready to go. Commissioner Fish.
Mayor, thank you, and colleagues, and to the members of the public who are joining us here today. This spring, the Oregon Health Authority notified the city of Portland that effective September of this year, they were going to revoke our Bull Run treatment variance. When we got that news, I directed the Water Bureau to come to council in a work session and to explain what that means, to lay out the various options, and to answer your questions. That is the purpose of today's presentation. We're going to start with a PowerPoint, and we have lots of experts and special guests, and I'll turn it over to Director Mike Stewart. Mike?
Good morning, Mr. Mayor, Commissioners. Thank you all for joining us this morning. In some sense, I feel a bit of deja vu or ennui. It seems I was sitting in this chair in 2009 doing roughly the same thing I'm going to do this morning. At the table with me is Gabe Solmer, the Deputy Director, and I'd like to introduce a few other invited guests that are out there. And since I can't see behind me, if you would please raise your hands when I call your name, that would be great. First is Dr. Paul Lewis, Health Officer for Multnomah County. He's been a very able, capable partner in all of our water quality and health efforts. Tony Russell, representing Oregon Health Sciences University. Mark Knudsen, CEO of Tualatin Valley Water District, our biggest wholesale customer. Brian Stahl from Rockwood People Utilities District, another of our wholesale customers. We have Colleen Johnson and Alan Warman, co-chairs of the Public Utility Board, and Janice Thompson from the Citizens Utility Board. Thank you all for coming.
Mike, we have other members of the pub, if you could just ask them to raise their hands.
And if there are other members of the pub here, please do raise your hands. Last but certainly not least, I have some Water Bureau staff here because I don't know everything. Teresa Elliott, our chief engineer. Dave Peters, principal engineer, who led the design effort for the UV plant that we have a design for. Yona Akagi, our water quality section head. And Nicole Adams, our communications director. And with that, I will leap into the presentation. So our goal today, although we don't necessarily expect you to give us direction today, but is to begin the process of getting council direction to address the Oregon Health Authority's announced revocation of our variance. The variance is technically revoked officially on 22 September, or earlier if we come to agreement on a plan of action. So it's 22 September or sooner. The Bull Run Watershed, our beautiful watershed, is our first line of protection for public health for the city. All water systems operate on a multi-barrier approach, and our first step in this is the protected watershed of Bull Run. I can't officially say that it is the most protected watershed in the country, but I'm happy to say it's among the most protected watersheds in the country. And that puts us in good shape. It is the reason that we have an unfiltered supply. There are currently 5 unfiltered systems in the country: Seattle, New York, San Francisco, Boston, and Portland. Although 3 of those, Seattle, New York, and San Francisco, have both filtered and unfiltered sources. Existing treatment system. First and foremost is the watershed. We carefully protect the watershed in coordination with the U.S. Forest Service. Then we treat with chlorine and ammonia, and we also do corrosion control. Right now, our pH is at 8.2, and it's moving to 8.3 once the system stabilizes where it's at the moment.
Could you just give me the quick primer on chlorine and ammonia? Why are they added?
Chlorine is added at Headworks, and then it travels about 10 miles to Lusted Hill, and we add ammonia, and what that does is turn it into a chloramine. And what that does is make the chlorine last longer to make it all the way through the system.
And the chlorine does what?
The chlorine inactivates most of the things like Giardia and so on that you don't want in the water.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. I appreciate it.
The regulatory landscape, this is an outcome of long-term 2 enhanced surface water treatment rule, which we all call LT2. The rule was designed to reduce illness, as it says, particularly regarding Cryptosporidium. And you'll note in this regulation that it just says Cryptosporidium. It doesn't separate the various types of Cryptosporidium. It allowed us to achieve a variance, which we successfully got, and then operated for 5 years. The fundamental premise of the variance was that the water that came out of the Bull Run watershed was the equivalent to water that came out of filtration plant, 0.0075 OSIS per liter. We had a little problem with that this spring. Cryptosporidium itself, it's a microscopic parasite. It's 4 to 6 microns. I know that doesn't help you very much in size, but if you figure a human hair is about 40 microns, it's 1/10 the size of the diameter of a human hair, which is really, really tiny little thing. It causes cryptosporidiosis. It is an endemic parasite. It exists everywhere. If you Googled it on the news, you would find little small crypto events all around the country and some bigger ones. In 1993, the incident that caused the rule, it was in Milwaukee and 104 people died. Nearer to home, in 2013, Baker City had a crypto outbreak and 28% of the residents got sick. So it's definitely there. What had we done in the past? This has a long history. In 2009, we presented treatment options to council, and council directed us to do things out of that. 2 things. It directed us to design a UV plant because we had to be prepared to respond to the regulatory requirement, and it also directed us to seek a variance. What you see in front of you here on this table is 700 pages of drawings, and what you see behind you on a stack that is knee-high on me are the plans and or the specifications for a UV plant. And this big or little pile of paper that you see before you is worth $16 million. So we have a UV design on the shelf. At the same time, we pursued a variance, and we were able to convince the Oregon Health Authority at the time that our water was pretty close to what it comes out of a regular treatment plant. And in 2012, we got the variance. Once again, in this case, the variance does not discriminate between types of crypto. History of our sampling, 1990 to 2016. In some sense, this might be considered comparing apples and oranges because in the early years of testing, the testing methods weren't the same. But the identification of oocysts is. It's something that's manually identified in a laboratory with a very expensive microscope. We did pretty well. We got the variance in 2012, and for 5 years, we basically had no oocysts, sampling twice weekly. Then, flipping the page, this winter and spring, we got a fairly big surprise. January 6th, 2 oocysts, and we continued to find oocysts, eventually counting a total of 19 in 14 different samples. Out of an abundance of caution during this period, we switched to the groundwater system. The reason we did that is from a regulatory point of view, we didn't have to. But we have this other wonderful water source, and we wanted to kind of take a pause. And during that 30-day period, we went out and tested extensively around both reservoirs to see if we could find a identifiable source for the crypto, and we were unsuccessful in that search.
Why don't we have to worry about crypto in the groundwater?
Crypto doesn't occur in groundwater. It's a artifact of surface water and wildlife and human beings and stuff that you get from 600 or 700 feet down in rock has been thoroughly filtered already. So we don't have the problem with well water. If you had really shallow wells, and we don't, you might, I don't know, but for our production system, no.
Essentially nature's filtration system.
Right. So on March 8th, we notified OHA that we would have to drastically increase the volume of water sampled and not detect additional oocysts in order to remain below the critical threshold. And I thought I might try and put that into some perspective. I know lab people, they all do things in liters and milliliters, so I'll get out of liters and milliliters. The amount of sampling that we would have had to do is 43,000 gallons of water, and that was assuming we found no more oocysts. 43,000 gallons of water is like 8 of those big semi-milk trucks that you see driving down the road in basically 10-gallon bites. And all of those samples would have to be shipped all over the country. We would overwhelm every lab resource. I don't believe there's lab capacity in the country to do that sampling. There's 3,256 or so samples roughly required to do that. That would assume, if we were successful in that effort, if there was the lab capacity, which there isn't, that there were no mistakes, no samples lost, no samples broken. It was basically all perfect. So I think we honestly identified to the Oregon Health Authority that it would be logistically and physically impossible for us to sample that much. So on May 19th, following our letter to them in March.
I'm sorry,
Yes,
Mark, to
sir.
interrupt you. Could I ask you just, could you help me? I'm not finding a very good definition online here. So an oocyst is what?
An oocyst is what you
Oocyst.
call the individual cryptospore, and I can't explain why
And
they
so
call it that.
you found 19 of those in 14 positive samples. So what
Right.
is the difference between the oocyst and a positive sample?
Well, you
What
take,
makes a sample positive?
well, the sample had an oocyst in it, so you found more oocyst in one sample
Got it.
than in
Okay.
another.
And can you give those of us who are laymen some sense of understanding of what this means to find 19 oocysts in 14 positive samples? I don't have a sense of magnitude.
Yona, can you come on up here and talk about how you translate the oocyst we find into the numbers of oocysts in the system? Yeah. And please introduce yourself
Thank you.
for the record.
Hi, I'm Yona Kagi. I'm the Water Quality Manager for the Water Bureau. So as Mike was saying, an oocyst is kind of the state that the crypto is in. It's kind of this resting state. And the oocyst is what we detect on a slide. So the end of the testing process is that you have an analyst who's looking at a slide and they're looking for these oocysts. And so they can see one oocyst, they can see 0, or they can see 1, 2, 3, however many oocysts. So you can have a positive slide. And we did have a few positive slides that had 1 oocyst, some that had 2, and some that had 3 oocysts. So that's how you can end up with 14 samples that had a total of
Okay,
19
so
oocysts
if
in
you
them.
have an oocyst in a sample, how big is the sample?
So
Because the oocyst is microscopic, correct?
the oocyst is microscopic. So we start off with 50-liter samples.
50
So we
liters.
collect 50 liters of water, and then through a series of steps, we filter that onto a filter, and then you concentrate what's on the filter, and through a few different steps until you get basically kind of a drop that you put on a
So
slide.
is 50 liters a bathtub full? How many?
50 liters is
Slightly more than a bathtub. Okay, so you have one microscopic sample in a bathtub, and
And that's indicative of how many spores there might be in all the water that's passed through.
Okay.
So there's lots of spores when you find 14 in the sample regime.
okay, so that then is a significant threshold, given the acceptable number is apparently 0. Is that
The
correct?
acceptable number is 0.0075 oocyst per liter.
So pretty much 0.
Yeah.
Okay, very good. Okay, that's
It's very
helpful.
wonky.
I was just trying to
Yeah.
get some sense of perspective. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. So on May 19th, OHA revoked the variance with an effective date of 22 September or earlier if we come to an agreement earlier on a plan. What we must do is on August 11th, 2017, we have to submit Cryptosporidium treatment technology and a schedule for achieving that. And we also have to submit interim control measures and a sampling schedule, because until we get this thing built, we're essentially operating like we are we are now. So variance is no longer an option. We had a good run for 5 years, but I think in someone looking at this would say that your water is obviously not always what comes out of a treatment plant. And so we're now required to do treatment. The next slide is kind of a context picture. It doesn't really have regulatory meaning. It's just a way for me to help describe to you the things I'm going to talk about in a few minutes. There's kind of a short-term solution, in which case we comply with the regulation. It has lower cost, and I'll go through some details on that, and it meets the immediate public health requirement. There's also a longer-term solution. It takes longer to do. It does a whole bunch more things than just meet the requirement of inactivating the crypto oocysts, and we'll go through that. It does meet the current public health requirement, and it also adds risk reduction and resilience to our system in other ways, and I'll talk about that as I go through them. So you can feel free to ask questions at any time, of course. Resilience threats to the system. Watershed fire. We don't have a high occurrence of fire in the watershed. It's kind of an interesting, partly weather anomaly and partly because the watershed is so protected. But there is a return period on fires, and if you have, it doesn't really take a huge fire, although that would do it, but a smaller fire in the wrong place can affect system operation. So that's a threat. Earthquake is a threat. Couple of ways that an earthquake can be a threat. One's very wonky. It's a thing called a seiche. That is when a landslide dumps itself into a body of water and creates a big wave. That could happen. There could also be damage to facilities. Landslides themselves, emerging contaminants. There's nothing near-term on the horizon, but as the professionals watch regulation, public health regulation always gets tighter. It never gets easier. So there will be additional regulation in the future. Algae, we have algae issues. So that's a resilience issue. And then there is climate change. In terms of climate change, we spend a lot of time and energy watching climate. We participate in the Utility Climate Alliance, Western Utility Climate Alliance, and are very active there. And our take and the universities' take around us, UW, OSU, that study this in our area, our belief is that our winters are going to get wetter and our summers hotter and drier. And both of those things have effects on the system as far as resilience goes.
Is the dam at the watershed, at the reservoir, is that earthquake resistant?
Yes, ma'am. Our dams are very safe. Because we have powerhouses on both of them, we are regulated by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, another one of the agencies we deal with directly. We have to do a study every 3 years called a Part 12. It's just a part of the federal law, but it specifies what you have to do. And basically, you have to re-examine every possible failure mode that the dam could have and analyze it. And we're in good shape from the dams from a seismic event.
Up to and including the big subduction zone 9.0?
Yes, I think so.
Great, thank you.
The second page of resilience effort, a seismic plan. We actually have just completed our seismic plan, and we have a supply system master plan. That's where we talk about things we need to do in the future to make sure we have necessary water supply. All of this can be roped into this treatment equation. So treatment technologies. There's two piles of treatment technologies. One that inactivates the oocyst. I say kill it, but nobody likes that word, so inactivates the oocyst. And then there's removal. The inactivation means are UV, ozone, and chlorine dioxide. In the past, we have kicked out ozone It has similar benefits to UV. It inactivates the O-assist, but the capital costs are much higher and the operating costs are much higher. Ozone also has, because it's chemistry and gas, it has issues with temperature. So really cold water, it doesn't function nearly as well. And we have really cold water in the winter. So ozone was thrown out of the pile. The other one, chlorine dioxide, was thrown out because of chemistry. Chlorine dioxide at the dosages that we need to use produces something called disinfection byproducts. And the disinfection byproducts that are produced are so high that they cross the minimum contaminant level threshold. So essentially, rather logically, we're down to UV disinfection and filtration, which is kind of where we were in 2009. Current treatment, I'm not going to try and read this slide to you. You can kind of take a look at it, but there's one unfiltered system with a variance, us, and nobody else. 71 systems that produce more than 100 million gallons per day use filtration. 4 are unfiltered with UV disinfection. If you look at the slide, you can kind of see we're the Lone Ranger in this department. So let's switch to talk about UV. Conceptually very simple. It's a light bulb that operates at a particular frequency. It has to be a particularly defined distance from the O-cyst, but it's basically a light bulb that inactivates the microorganism inside the little shell that it lives in. The cost of UV, we have a reasonably accurate estimate for the state we were in, and this is the 2012 numbers, about $105 million. Our readiness to execute a UV plant is high. We have this. We would have to go through this. It's heavy-duty mechanical electrical equipment that was specified 5 years ago. So you have to go through the design and check and make sure that every piece of mechanical and electrical equipment in here that was specified, one, is still manufactured, it still does what it was chosen to do, and its footprint is still the same. So that would affect whether or not it would fit in the buildings that were designed. So we would have to spend 8 or 9 months going through this page by page and the specification pile page by page to make sure it would still do what it was supposed to do. But fundamentally, I don't think that's a problem. It's just time consuming.
Wouldn't it kill other microorganisms like Giardia as well?
Does it kill Giardia, Yona? I don't think so.
It does, but you need slightly different doses for. Can you come to the
Come back and sit here. Ultimately, it doesn't really matter for Giardia, though, because the chlorine kills the Giardia. Its real effect is only on crypto, and in the future, that's probably all it does is does crypto. And if you want to correct me, go ahead.
No, I think that's correct. Both UV does inactivate Giardia as well, but our chlorine takes care of our Giardia and our viruses and bacteria.
And we have to use chlorine anyway.
So
other
that's
things.
my question. Why, if it kills, so doesn't UV doesn't kill virus?
Viruses take a higher dose of UV, and so I think the dose that the plant was designed at was to take care of both crypto and Giardia, but not viruses. But viruses are very susceptible to chlorine, which crypto is resistant to chlorine. So
Yeah, I was just wondering, could we reduce the chlorine if we have a UV? That's where I was going with this.
why would we?
Could we reduce the amount of chlorine if we are using UV, and that would take care of some
I'll
of the...
speculate, probably not, because one of the major challenges in chlorine is you put it in where you put it in, and it has to be viable all the way to the end of the system with a specified residual, so we would end up putting the same in regardless to deal with the residual requirements.
Great, thank you.
It's the ammonia then that, it's the
around.
ammonia, Michael, that then allows the chlorine to last
Yeah,
throughout
it becomes
the
a
remainder of the system.
chloraminate, and it lasts longer.
Okay, thanks.
Next picture is just kind of pictures of what a UV, what do they call those things?
Reactor.
Reactor, what a UV reactor looks like. And I think this is the one that we specified. Basically, you put this in the lines and you run the water through it. The water has to go through at a specified velocity, and it's of a size that makes sure that the light intensity is proper throughout the inside of this thing so that it inactivates. And we still have to do testing to prove that we have done it, that we've succeeded.
And how many lines do you have where these would have to be installed?
I think we have 4 conduits, and I don't remember the breakdown of how many of these things go in, but we could look it up in here. This is what the inside of one looks like, Victoria, British Columbia, very large system. And they also have very small ones. Portland Public Schools uses them for swimming pool disinfection, or parks rather, for swimming pool disinfection, and they're frequently used on places like my farm where you have a well. So it's very common technology, and it's effective for what it does. It just only does basically one thing. Filtration, the next thing, the solids, which would include crypto and almost anything else floating around, gets removed by the filtration plant. It provides more stable water. It does a lot of things to reduce the system vulnerability in the resilience arena, which I'll talk about more in a minute. The cost is $350 to $500 million. The reason we have a range of numbers there is that we never really designed or analyzed the system. The numbers are accurate for the level of information we have. Our readiness to execute something like this is low. It would take us 10 to 12 years to do this. It would begin with a planning study that would figure out exactly what the right kind of filtration was going to be. And there are a bunch of choices in there. It's not just simple filtration. There's a slow sand filter, there's a fast sand filter, there's a multimedia, and there's membrane filtration. And there's a variety of reasons to choose either one, and we would do essentially a water quality study and figure out which one of those work best for the kind of water that we have.
And as long as we're working on it, the OHA would say that's okay?
Yes, ma'am. Couple of pictures here, direct filtration. This is when people say filtration plant, this is mostly what they mean. It's tanks full of sand or tanks full of artificial media that do the same thing as sand. There's pictures here of Clackamas rivers. Membrane filtration, Clackamas River water has one of these. It's very, very effective. It's also the most expensive one, takes a bunch of energy to run one, but extremely effective and removes virtually anything that anybody knows about right now. So those are kind of the two choices that are there, UV plant or some kind of filtration. One costs roughly $105 million. The other is $350 to $500 million. One we are ready to do, or readier to do. We couldn't let the contract right now, but soon. And the other one, we would have to do a planning study and then design it and then build it. Treatment location options. The UV plant goes at headworks. That's what this one is designed. The reason it goes at headworks is you want to do the UV treatment before you dump anything else in the water. The less you've got in the water, the better. You get better results that way. And there's space to do it. There's about 10 or 11 acres there total, and it all fit. Most likely, we would put a filtration plant at Lusted Hill in a site we call Carpenter Lane. We own 90 acres up there that was purchased years ago for this purpose if we needed to do it. It takes about 30 acres to put in any kind of filtration plant, maybe a little smaller acreage for membrane filtration, but about 30 acres to do it. So we have the real estate up there. One of the things we could do if we built that would be to put in solar and help offset the energy costs that are expended in a filtration plant, or a UV plant for that matter. Go ahead.
just to clarify, we talked about direct and membrane filtration. So direct would be somewhere like Clackamas, and you saw the pictures there. Membrane is done in San Diego. Just a little shout out to my hometown.
So cost and schedule, I've already mentioned that. UV disinfection, 5 years, $105 million. A filtration plant, 10 to 12 years, $350 to $500 million. I'm sorry I don't have a more accurate number, but we haven't done the studies to make it more accurate than that. Rate impacts, we didn't work terribly hard on rate impacts. We know what the general numbers are, but in developing a rate impact, we kind of wanted your direction on which one we were choosing, and we'll be prepared to put that in a memo.
So let me just put out a marker right now. Obviously, there's a cost-benefit trade-off here. And before I choose option A or option B or even an option C, I'd want to know what the trade-off is, the cost, the benefit. It would be helpful for me and probably for my colleagues to have a more detailed study on the relative costs of these options as well as how we would pay for them. And I realize that your bureau alone probably cannot do that work, but I think we need to do that work before we offer guidance on which of these is the best option.
We can undertake that. And I think, and I'll talk a little bit in a subjective way about the benefits of the various systems as we continue along, but I understand.
Very good.
But if I could just add, in 2009-10, the cost of the filtration was estimated at $5 million. And then the Water Bureau took another $12 million to develop these detailed cost estimates or plan, right? So it seems to me that's a tall order to ask you to nail down filtration system cost in the next 2 months. So I'm just wondering, it would still be a ballpark for filtration, right?
Our fundamental challenge is we have to choose and pick a course of action. We don't have to know the numbers exactly, at least from OHA's point of view. Planning level numbers for the filtration plant, we can do a fairly good job with, and we can figure out what a rate forecast might look like. It's simpler for this thing because we have a pretty accurate estimate for this dated 2012, and we would escalate the cost for that. So I think it's not a problem to provide numbers one needs at this stage.
That would be helpful. And I'm trying, and I don't want to just dump this in your lap because I understand the complexity of it, but it might be helpful for us to seek some independent financial advice on this. For example, a probability analysis could be used. You know, what is the risk, for example, if we take option one, give us a probabilistic estimate of what could happen if we don't go the full bore with the filtration, and then assign costs to those risks. I mean, it seems to me we should be able to do more than just a subjective trade-off study. We should be able to do a probabilistic cost-benefit analysis.
Mayor, we look forward to working with your office and with the Chief Financial Officer and the Bureau to sort of figure out what can we do in the timeframe that provides additional useful information for the council and the public to make that decision. We look forward to working.
Who dictates the time frame? Is that OHA?
OHA dictates the time frame, and they might get help.
I have 2 questions.
Yes,
I know
ma'am.
you're about to go into the kind of relative merits of each, but page 15 begs the question for me, why have 95% of the other municipalities we've looked at chosen filtration? And then my other question is about turbidity, which you might get into, but are both our water sources at risk for that in the event, turbidity, in the event of a major
The
earthquake?
groundwater is not at
Groundwater
risk for
isn't at all.
turbidity. It's
Okay.
just the watershed bull run.
Someone want to
And
start?
your first question?
why have 90% of the municipalities we've looked at in this survey chosen filtration over UV?
We think we have a very clean system, and our citizens supported that, and other communities chose to build filtration plants.
But why filtration over UV when they had the choice?
Go ahead.
I can take a stab at that. So filtration is kind of the standard practice. So I think when these plants all chose to go for filtration, it wasn't because of Cryptosporidium. So there were rules that came out before that you had to deal with other pathogens like bacteria, viruses, and giardia. And pretty much there's surface water systems and then the groundwater systems. So pretty much almost all surface water systems filter their water. As Mike said, there's really only five large systems that don't filter, and that's because we have kind of exceptionally high water quality with protected watersheds, and we have an exemption to filtration. So filtration is the standard, and we have an exemption to filtration.
Okay.
When crypto came along, the filter plants, just because they are filtered, already treat for crypto. And so it's really then the plants that weren't treating, the unfiltered, that went ahead with UV.
Great.
If
Thanks.
that makes sense.
Yeah.
So flipping to page 25, UV benefits. Obviously, it's least cost option by a substantial margin. Speed of construction, we can probably get this done in 5 years. A very important consideration is that in the course of producing the UV plant design, we have all the land use done and it's approved. That's a very big bite to take that we'll have to go through for a filtration plant. We're almost guaranteed to win because we're a public water supply, but it's a big process that you have to go through. That process has been done for the UV plant. The design is completed and can be constructed with minimal update of the design. UV trade-offs does not address high turbidity. Basically, all the UV plant does is inactivate cryptospores, which is the regulatory requirement at the moment. It doesn't add anything to supply, and I'll explain that a little more when we talk about filtration. It doesn't address future regulations. Water professionals who watch all this, we try and be ahead of the game for regulation when we can by watching what's going to happen, because being up against these kind of deadlines is difficult, to say the least. It doesn't do anything for water quality beyond inactivating cryptospores. And it does not protect us against the loss of a filtration waiver. We have a waiver right now, and we could lose that if someone changes the criteria. Filtration benefits. Best pathogen protection. It does about anything that anybody can foresee on the horizon right now is done in a standard filtration plant. It reduces disinfection byproducts. That's kind of a wonky chemistry thing, and if you need to get into the chemistry, Ona can answer the questions. But it reduces disinfection byproducts. It addresses high turbidity. Right now, the rules require that we not serve water that is more than 5 nephelometric units. I have a hard time pronouncing that. We generally won't go above 3, and we switch to groundwater. A filtration plant makes that a less frequent option, switching to groundwater, because we can deal with higher turbidity in a filtration plant. A UV plant doesn't do anything for turbidity, and if the turbidity gets high enough, you have to shut the filtration plant off and switch to groundwater because the light isn't doing what it needs to do, shooting through cloudy water, essentially. It addresses toxic algae concerns. It keeps sediment out of the distribution system because we filter it all out. It reduces reliance on groundwater because we can use more water in the reservoirs. That's a supply. Essentially, we have added to supply. As you go deeper into the reservoirs, it gets a little bit murkier in English. And right now, because of the nephelometric units, we can't do that. If we have a filtration plant, we can take advantage of more supply. It addresses future regulation and emerging contaminants. Basically, anything that we see on the horizon today, it's not to say it doesn't change in the future, but a filtration plant deals with that. Trade-offs. It's much more expensive than a UV plant. Takes longer to comply, so we'll be essentially operating like we are now for a much longer period. We're going to start from scratch, that's clear. Higher maintenance cost. Our variance is about $1 million a year right now. That's going away. A UV plant is about $2.5 million to operate. A filtration plant is $4 to $5 million to operate. A lot of that is in energy costs. So our options right now are to choose to do the UV system or start planning for a filtration system. That's simply put. So what we need to get today, or not today, but in the not too far distant future, we need a decision on what to do so we can keep complying with the regulation. And I'm sorry to dump this on you in this short of a deadline, but here we are.
No, it's all good. Thank you. If there's not immediate questions, could I put Dr. Lewis on the spot a little bit here and get Dr. Lewis's opinion? Obviously, Multnomah County is a hugely important partner to us from the public health perspective, and I've always relied heavily on my colleagues at Multnomah County for advice, and certainly you've been engaged in this process, and it would be welcome to hear your thoughts. Thanks for coming, Paul.
Yeah, I think.
I'm sorry, you have to state your name.
Yeah, hi, this is Paul Lewis, Multnomah County Health Officer. Mayor Wheeler, Commissioners, thanks for having me. You know, over the years, I've had a lot of opportunity to work with Mike and his team, and I do want to compliment them and Commissioner Fish. It's really, you know, we often are working fast under a lot of pressure and a lot of scrutiny, and I really found them to be a great team to work with, often, you know, difficult situations. Some of you remember my predecessor, Gary Oxman, when you were county chair, and he worked extensively with the Water Bureau. He's got a plaque in the office that I have from the Water Bureau on that, and I think he had a very helpful and long-term view of this, is that we've got a 125-year-old system. We've got the best water on the planet, but it's an aging system. And as we make decisions, whether it's covering the reservoirs, et cetera, we should think to the future, because we want it to go another 125 years successfully. Now, the next thing I'm going to say is awkward, and
Go for it. Well, time is up, Dr. Lewis, but thank you for being here.
So again, I think you have a lot to consider in a very short amount of time, and you have to make big decisions for the city, lots of constraints, fiscal and otherwise. I think the awkward thing I'm about to say is that if we look back over the last 6 months, and it's easier looking back than it was on those early days in January when we were all wound pretty tight, is that we did not see a human health problem from Cryptosporidium during the 12 weeks, 19 samples, 14 hits, whatever those numbers are. And we couldn't say that as distinctly at the time, right? Because if you're exposed to a bug, it takes a few days to get sick, and then you have to decide, do I want to go see a doctor or nurse, something like that, and get tested, et cetera. But we can look back now, and we were basically at or below the average number, and that average number in January and February is in the county of 800,000 people is 3 or 4 cases per month. And so it's literally, I mean, again, January and February it was a total of 6 in all of Multnomah County. So again, the threat to human health, you can never say it was 0, because 0 is impossible to get to, but it did not appear to be elevated. Is that what you were looking for?
That's very helpful
Okay.
context.
Yeah. So-
I wasn't steering you in any particular direction, but that is helpful context.
And again, I think, one of my other jobs with the county has to do with public health emergency preparedness, and I think Mike outlined in pretty good detail that there's a degree of resilience for things that we can't control, like storms, fires, drought, climate change, that are additional benefits of filtration, as well as some things that aren't yet defined. With less cloudy water, there are less chemical reactions going on with the chlorine and ammonia, And the disinfection byproducts, again, basically are things called trihalomethanes, I believe, things like that. So these are chlorinated organic compounds, which in general are not good for human health, and they are regulated. We'd like there to be less of them.
Understood. Thank you. We appreciate your
Thanks.
perspective. Thanks for being here. Sorry to put you on the spot, but that was helpful. Thank you.
Here, let's open it up to council questions and questions for this panel, and also additional, I'd like to open it up for questions as well as additional information that you look provided to you after this hearing.
Well, I'll just jump in. One issue related to helping us understand the costs of the options and how we might pay for those options it has been raised previously. Is there an option to start with one option with an intention of over the long term building towards the second option? Or is that just too convoluted? Are these truly either or options?
Dave, you want to come up?
Poor Dave, he thought he was going to be safe in the back of the room over there.
I think that's why I
Nobody's
sat
safe
along
here.
the wall.
Dave, if you could just state your name for the record, please, and your position.
Hello, I'm David Peters, Principal Engineer with the Water Bureau. And the question was, could we start with one option and move to another? And we have thought about that, and that is a possibility in that with filtration, the things that we would build with for UV up at Headworks, those facilities and buildings would be able to be repurposed for use when we get into the filtration type of the filtration design. So there is some thought that we could begin to, if we went to UV now, we'd get 10 or 12 years on the UV equipment. We'd still be able to reutilize those facilities at a later date.
And if I may, Commissioner, just so the play here clearly would be go in with an option that has the lesser impact on ratepayers, which is a consideration, while still putting in place the infrastructure that would enable us to expand or change course as regulations change course. And part of the advantage, if we could go right towards the filtration, is we are anticipating whatever regulatory changes might come in the next 20, 25 years.
So
But they haven't come yet.
it's really difficult to anticipate, and the water professionals' answer has been filtration plants,
Okay.
because they are so effective and they appear to be able to handle anything anybody's been able to cook up. I'm not sure that depends upon how you look at this, so I'm not sure that Dave has answered your question, if I understood your question. There are some utilities that use both UV and filtration, and I think this is what Dave's talking about. If you want to optimize your filtration, there are ways to do that, and I'm not quite certain, without doing the studies, how applicable that may or may not be.
I guess rephrasing the question, it would be, can we come into compliance now, but make the investments that we're making today count towards going ultimately towards a more robust filtration type system? Or is that just I'll use my funny pun, is that a pipe dream?
That's a good dream. So, as we did the water quality study for a filtration plant, it might become apparent that continuing to use the UV plant would be a good thing. I'll just share with you how I think about this. If I was made of money, and if I had a printing press on the third floor instead of a billing machine, I would build a filtration plant and I wouldn't think twice about it. It does so many things for us, and Your question about statistics is a very difficult one because many of the events I'm talking about, or that we are talking about as high risk, are high risk, low probability events, black swan events. And no one deals with those terribly well. A fire in the watershed is a 350-year event. It's about like a subduction zone earthquake, which is 350 to 500-year event, depending upon which hunk of the zone splits. And the way that we have chosen to deal with that in the state is the Oregon Resilience Plan that says you will plan for it because it's a high probability or low probability, very high consequence event, and we need to be prepared to deal with it. And that's the way I look at most of the watershed stuff. It's not, unless you combine several events at once, there's probably some statistical way to look at it, but in some ways I'm not sure that there's a heck of a lot of light shed on deciding what needs to be decided. So I go back to Mike's perfect world. Well, I don't have a printing press on the third floor, I have a billing machine. Our ratepayers are carrying a fairly stiff burden right now with other LT2 projects. So when I look to the future, and so I'll tell you what I see, and then I'll tell you why I see it. If somebody was going to give me the power of the pen today, I would pull the trigger on this.
On what?
On the UV plant. Not because it's not the best thing, but we have a lot of things that we need to do, and we have some things we have to do. We have to deal with this. It's the law. We lost the variance. That was the fight to get the variance. I think from a public health point of view, and I'm not a doctor, so I don't feel quite so free as Dr. Lewis to talk about it. I am someone who is charged with complying with regulations. So that's your cover, so to speak. Mm-hmm. There were, in the Milwaukee outbreak, which the circumstances don't compare to us at all, but if you look at Baker City, Las Vegas, other places with crypto outbreaks, the possibility exists, and my protection is to comply with the law. It's substantive compliance with regulations, so I must comply. So if I look at the burden the ratepayers are carrying, I have this thing that I have to do. I must complete the reservoir job at Washington Park, and I must deal with this, either filtration plant or a UV plant. So then I'm left with, okay, what next? I have to do, not because there's a law saying it, but I feel like we have to complete the Willamette River crossing. I think that's responsible. That's another one of those black swan events. It's the 350-year, 500-year, or maybe even the Portland Hills Fault might do enough damage. I don't know. But we have to complete that. We have to do our slow progress that we're making on our seismic resilience plan. So when I look at all of those things, what if you gave me the power of the pen today to do, what I would do I would build this thing. This is all mechanical and electrical equipment. In 25 years, 30 years, you're going to do a major overhaul. I would have it in my mind that I might not do that overhaul. I would begin at the next budget cycle putting money away to build a filtration plant. And that would offset the cost and reduce the rate impact later. And I would build this and operate it, and I would build a sinking fund or a rate stabilization account, whatever you want to call it, so that when the time came for this thing to get its time out because it's too old, I have planned and designed, and I have under construction a filtration plant. That would be how I might go about this.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
May I go next?
Yeah, please. Thank you.
So in 2009, when I was the rookie on the council, our Commissioner Fish and Commissioner Saltzman and I prevailed in saying we don't have this Cryptosporidium in our watershed, so let's choose the least expensive option. to treat for something that we don't have. That was essentially the argument that we used, which then prevailed. Now we do have evidence that we have crypto. Not a lot, but it's a bit. And as you say, it doesn't make any difference whether we do or not. We now have been told you have to do it. I understood from the presentation that the ultraviolet would be at the headwaters by the dam. The filtration would be at Lusted Hill. So we could do just what you said, have the UV plant get going on that now, and then later do what Merit suggested, do both, because there's no situation in which you would put filtration at headwaters?
No, there's no way to fit it in there. It's kind of a convenience. I almost wish I brought a drawing over here, but it's as busy as any under street you've seen opened up here underneath the ground at Headworks. There are big pipes everywhere.
Yeah.
And it just works out that we can fit all the UV stuff in there, but a filtration plant, it's too small and the parts are too big. It would be much better to build it essentially in the dry. It's ready to go and you turn it on. And there are some other things that we need to do to build, that we could do in advance, actually, to build a treatment plant at Lusted. And one of them is what we call Conduit 5. We need to put another pipe in and have that installed to bring the water up there. So it's kind of a complicated thing. I don't mean to oversimplify it in talking about it, but that's how I think about it.
But there would be more environmental impacts at Lusted Hill.
I'm sorry.
There would be more environmental impacts from building it at Lusted Hill. So we would have concerns from environmentalists about.
What we're building it on is farmland. We own 90 acres, and right now it's leased to a tree farmer. What I would do, and we would probably, Dave may have thought about this, but right now, the way our system operates, we're extremely fortunate in that we use very little electricity compared to most utilities. Most utilities pump. Either the UV plant, which is electricity, or a filtration plant where we would need a small, well, not small, but a fairly low head pumping station to move the water along. One of the things that we could do is put in a solar field on the 90 acres for the UV plant and offset energy there for both.
But it is currently in trees.
Yes, it's a tree farm.
Okay. And I think you just said that the replacement schedule for UV is about 25 to 30 years.
I think so. It's mechanical and electrical stuff, and all of it wears out at different rates. The electronics is 5 to 10 years. Electrical switchgear is 10 to 15, maybe 20 years. Pumps and so on, if they're used constantly, it's more, and then the UV things themselves wear out.
And then what about the replacement schedule for filtration? How long will that last?
As long as sand lasts. It's a big filtration plant. There'll be pumps and motors in it, but the bulk of it is big concrete tanks that have filter media in them of some sort. There's pumps to move it around and so on and so forth, but we haven't really estimated that, so I really wouldn't want to wing the number.
But you did say in it this costs more on an annual basis.
Yes.
I do remember that from the 2009 discussion that we had concerns about the waste product because it's sandy, it's filtered, you've got to take that somewhere, right?
Yes, we have, I don't know if it's hazardous materials disposal?
It
No,
is not
it's
hazardous
not.
material disposal. We just talked to Tacoma, who recently put in a facility like this, a direct filtration facility. They take theirs to a landfill. It's inert material. It's the soil that is in our water, basically.
Right, okay. And then I remember from 2009 there was a discussion about the light bulbs needed for the UV and the concern that they might break and leak mercury into the system. Do you know if the technology's improved, or would that still be a concern?
The technology has not changed, but there are several mechanisms that were built into the design to prevent the mercury from getting into the drinking water system. So the mercury is inside the light bulb itself, and that's just like it is in most fluorescent lamps. There's a small amount of mercury. Those bulbs are inside a quart sleeve, so it's protected from basic things that go through. But if it should break, what we know about mercury is, one, it's not water soluble, and it's a heavy element that drops to the bottom of the reactor. So we can find the mercury and clean it out within that reactor.
And Seattle's been using it for a while, right?
Seattle
The
has been
UV.
using UV,
Have they had any untoward side effects,
not that I'm aware of.
problems? Okay,
They've had some, they have had broken bulbs. I think most utilities have had
okay.
one in
So
the past.
after Commissioner Udaley's had her turn to ask questions, I'd like to hear from the pub and the cub, if that'd be all right, Commissioner?
I'm sorry, I was reading. My
Obviously,
apologies.
Commissioner Udaley's going to have some questions, but then after that, are we going to get some advice from the pub and or the cub?
We have the right to invite anyone up we want, so we'd be happy
Thanks.
So I was not here in 2009, but I certainly know that this was a very contentious issue, and I've received a handful of letters from constituents, and the one common thread seems to be the lack of distinction between pathogenic versus non-pathogenic Cryptosporidium. And I know the EPA doesn't distinguish, and can we give the public any explanation why? And is that an issue that's worth pushing back on? Because my understanding is what we found is the non-pathogenic crypto.
Do you want to take a
Yeah,
shot?
I can speak about that a little bit. So there are certainly, so there's many different types of species of crypto. There's certainly a few that, thank you. So there's many different types of crypto. There's a few that are responsible for most of the waterborne outbreaks. Those are two, Cryptosporidium parvum and Cryptosporidium hominis. And then there's other ones that haven't been linked to outbreaks, but they, like the CDC, hasn't deemed them that they're not pathogenic yet. They just haven't been linked, or they've been found in some isolated cases. So there's kind of this hierarchy, kind of the worst ones, and then the ones that, you know, aren't great, and then the ones that they just have never really been linked to human infections. So it's not just limited to those two, I should say, but those two are the ones that are kind of responsible for most of the outbreaks. Of the 19 oocysts that we were able to detect, we do try to genotype each one, and we were able to genotype 4 of them. So the 4 that we were able to genotype, the success rate just isn't very high for being able to genotype. You have a slide, and you have this microscopic thing on the slide. You have to get it off the slide, and then it has to have enough DNA in it that you have to be able to replicate, and then go through all these processes, and then they can match up and kind of try to figure out what type of crypto it is. So of the 4 we found were not the 2 kinds that are most linked to human outbreaks, parvum or hominis. I will say we were able to genotype 4. There were 15 oocysts that we were not able to genotype. So it's unclear to us what kind those are.
So from a regulatory point of view, you can't use that as a good gatekeeper because 1, it takes a long time. 2, it may or may not work. And 3, not all are identified with hominis or parvum. So in some respects, I go back to the part of regulations give you regulatory cover that you must comply with the regulation. And we cut the deal that we did, and it became obvious this past year that our water system does not deliver water to the standard of a filtration plant, essentially. Another way to look at it is one of the more difficult purposes, is kind of gets to the mayor's statistical question, is one of the purposes of health regulation is to prevent bad outcomes and to protect your most vulnerable populations. And if crypto takes hold, it can wreak havoc on your most vulnerable populations. And not that I want to compare us with Milwaukee, we don't have a sewer line running in front of a water intake that broke, but to say that there's not a possible for these outbreaks, you just look at Las Vegas, you look at Baker City, possibilities there.
Sure, thanks. I mean, that makes sense to me. I just think it's helpful to elaborate a little for the public's benefit. And my last question is, what happens if we don't comply? What are the consequences? Not that I'm suggesting we not comply, Commissioner Fish, but I also think that's important for people to
So
understand.
OHA is the regulatory authority. They can direct it. I'm not quite sure how that goes, but I think you can get hauled into court and forced to comply. And I think that if we did that, they would be getting help from the Environmental Protection Agency in that regard. So I think it would be a bad outcome, and the result would be the same, and we would lose control over how that transpired.
Thank you.
I just reminded of one question, that is about quantity. One of the advantages of filtration is that we could use the water from the reservoir more often. It was my recollection that the new underground tanks at both Powell Butte, Kelly Butte, and Washington Park are going to have more capacity than we currently have, or at least...
No, what we did when we built the reservoirs is the game in water is to move it as quickly as you can from the treatment facility to the tap so it doesn't deteriorate. People don't like to think about that, but in our mind, water deteriorates the longer it rests in the system. So I forget exactly what the number is. I think it's something like 15 million gallons. We reduced the amount of storage because modern treatment rules require us to push the water more quickly through the system. I think, at least in my mind, one of the benefits of being able to use additional storage is I believe in climate change. It's going to happen, and we're going to have hotter, drier summers, and we may need to use that water. And we can use water that's in the reservoir deeper if we have a filtration plant.
What about this? What about the colder, wetter winters? Is it snowmelt that feeds the reservoir in the summer?
I think the way we try and describe that is we're almost a rainforest. It's almost like the Olympics, but not quite. Snow is nice. It really is nice. I like snowshoeing. But the bulk of our water comes from rainfall. And so snow is a good thing to have around. It hangs around, but the way our system works, most of our water comes from rainfall.
Could I suggest to put a couple more people on the spot? Alan Warman, who's the co-chair of the Public Utility Board, and Janice Thompson from the Citizens Utility Board. I know they have interesting perspectives on these, and it might be good to hear their thoughts. Good morning. How are you doing today? Thanks for being here. I don't know if you had just any general thoughts, and I certainly wanted to leave the opportunity for commissioners to ask any questions they might have.
You bet. Alan Warman, the pub. On May 31st, we had our first initial meeting. It was sort of unplanned, but so was this. So we're basically going down an opportunity of asking questions amongst the pub members, and we're just doing the same requests and collection of information the same as you. July 11th is our next board meeting. We have time on the agenda for this subject because we're asking questions of what's the right thing to recommend back to you after that meeting. And I anticipate we'll have a recommendation after that meeting.
Excellent. I appreciate that.
You
very
betcha.
much.
Thank you for your service.
Good morning. It's good to see you again.
Janice Thompson, Oregon Citizens Utility Board. Well, at the May 18th utility rate hearing, this is one of the kind of future, in this case, not quite so future, coming really fast, issues, and urged a comprehensive review. So I think that's what is getting, is underway. CUB's focus is in other arenas, applies here, which is a least cost, least risk. So they're sometimes what is the cheapest doesn't really end up being the cheapest when you kind of factor in the risks involved. So that's definitely the way we're taking a look at it. Have been in conversations tracking this along the way. definitely attend pub convenings in the interest of just being efficient, and not having the Water Bureau kind of do 2 briefings at once. I did submit to the Bureau and to the offices yesterday kind of a list of questions, some of which I anticipated would be answered today, and some of them are, some of them are not. And so I will be following up and circling back.
That'd be helpful. And I don't know if anybody had any questions. Thank you for your hard work. We really appreciate it. Thanks for being here again.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So, and I don't know if we have additional questions. If not, I'd like to turn it back to Commissioner Fish for the wrap-up.
Thank you, Mayor and colleagues. Let me start by thanking Director Stewart and his team from the Water Bureau for putting together what I think was a very informative and comprehensive presentation today. I asked them to come and present the facts and the basic information that you, Mayor, and my colleagues need to begin to sort this through and hopefully reach some kind of consensus. And I really am appreciative of the work, Mike, of you and your team in doing that. There's a couple of milestones ahead I want to note, and then we'll address some of the questions that I heard at this work session. We do have a hold on a tentative council hearing on August 2nd, at which it is our hope that a resolution that reflects the consensus of the council will be heard and acted on, which keeps us on track to meet the OHA schedule of having a compliance schedule submitted by August 11th. As you heard from the pub and the cub, they will be holding a hearing on July 11th, and I would urge people that want to specifically testify further before August 2nd to attend that hearing. We'll also have opportunities to solicit further feedback from the public. There's basically 2 ways that happens. One is emails to my office or my colleague's office. We will share all the emails that each office gets, so there'll be a consolidated record. My office email address is nick@portlandoregon.gov. Secondarily, the Water Bureau later this week will be putting up a notice on their website as to how people in the public can submit testimony, questions, concerns, and we'll be monitoring that and trying to be as transparent as possible. Mayor, my big takeaway from this session is that you and my colleagues would like some more refined information about cost benefit and drill down a little bit to get maybe some more precise numbers, particularly around the option of filtration. And also to begin to look at how this might impact our forecasted rates over the next 5 years. As my colleagues know, regardless of the decision we make, it will have no impact over the next year and the rates that we set. So that we're talking about whatever impacts begin a year from now. But we will take a closer look at both the cost and the potential rate impacts. And Mayor, we'll also look a little closer at a kind of a hybrid option that got some conversation today, which is sequencing this as sort of first step, a UV investment with perhaps a longer term view towards filtration, and then some intermediate plan for how to begin to set aside the funding to cover that so that we're planning for the future. Does that capture the big picture? And of course, goes without saying that the Water Bureau, following up on this work session, will offer individual follow-up briefings with each council office to both respond to any questions and concerns you have and continue the conversation. And in the next month or so, we'll begin to see whether there is a consensus among the council members about how they wish to proceed.
Very good. And I want to thank you, Commissioner Fish, and Mike. I want to thank you and your team. This was a very well thought out, orchestrated work session. And I feel like there was a lot of good material presented here in a way that it was fairly easy to digest. So thank you for doing that. Thanks for being well organized. Unless there's anything else for the good of the order, we're adjourned. Thank you.